Welcome to At Work in America, sponsored by Paychex. At Work in America digs in behind the headlines and trends to the stories of real people making a difference in the world of work. And now, here are your hosts, Steve Bowes and Trish Steed.
Welcome to the At Work in America podcast. My name's Steve Bowes. I'm with Trish Steed. Trish, how are you?
I'm fantastic. How are you today?
Yeah, I'm really well. It's another fine day in my undisclosed location where I am recording and podcasting from, but the sun is out for hopefully for the rest of today. And I think, Trish, after this conversation, I'm out of here today. How
Are
about
you
that?
out of here? Taking the rest of the day off?
Why not?
I'm not going to do that, but I will say I'm getting to do tonight one of my most favorite things to do. There is a rodeo. So I'm in my home office here in Nebraska, and right next door is a big event center. There's like woods in between us, so it's not like glaring right there, but they have rodeos from time to time. So there's a rodeo tonight. So I'm going to watch barrel
Wow.
racing and no bull riding at this particular one.
Is it your first rodeo? I'm guessing
No.
not.
This is not my first rodeo, no.
Quite literally. Well, that does sound like fun. It is summertime as we record this, and I have noticed for sure work slowing down a little bit. Some of the work we're doing with our clients and partners, and even some of the recording we're doing. It's a different cadence right now, sort of in late July here as we record this, but that's okay. I
Right.
think folks definitely don't take enough time off. Certainly here in America, we know this.
They don't. And it's funny because I was watching the news just yesterday and they were talking about that people are doing, these vacations where it's like a hush vacation. Have you heard of that?
Yeah, the quiet
So that-
vacation thing, right?
yeah. Yeah, another channel is calling it hush, but same
Hush.
thing,
Okay.
right? So you're just working somewhere else, which is kind of what you're doing. You're
Kind
sort
of
of
what I'm doing. Yeah,
you're not really on vacation, but
I'm not.
we've talked about it, and you would think that being our own business that you could just take off, right? You can just take off, but we don't. So
Not totally, and maybe that's a problem for another day, but,
it
Trish,
is.
we have a great show today. We are, circling back on Workplace Movie Hall of Fame, our long-running series. This might be the 9th or 10th one of these, I'm not sure anymore how many we've
It's
done.
a lot.
We've done a fair number of them. We're gonna be talking about the movie Up in the Air, which, lots of people probably have seen, certainly, maybe back when it came out in 2009, or certainly on, streaming and rentals and things like that. It's become
Right.
a very popular workplace movie, because it has such major workplace themes running throughout the movie. It's largely is a movie about work and lots of workplace topics,
Yeah.
interspersed with a few other things in there as well. So we're going to break down that movie today, and talk about it, which is I'm excited for it because I rewatched it a couple of nights ago, and yeah, I forgot a lot of it, so it was good to kind of
You.
revisit it.
Yeah. I
Yeah,
mean, 2009, that was a long time ago, right? So
yeah.
I was shocked how long it's been out, and I had watched it in 2009. So yeah, it was fun to rewatch it. Kind of disheartening. We can talk about that later.
Yeah, not a happy movie really, but,
Not a
before we
happy
get
movie.
into, Up in the Air, let's thank our friends at Paychex, of course. This episode about Work in America is sponsored by Paychex, one of the leading providers of HR, payroll, retirement, and insurance solutions for businesses of all sizes. If you're a business leader or an HR leader navigating the complex world of hiring and retention, you need Paychex Essential Guide to Finding and Keeping Your Dream Team. This guide, Trish, will help you discover how to attract high quality employees, keep them engaged and motivated. It's got plenty of strategies and tips, ways you can leverage things like benefits and better technology, and just ways to set your company apart in a really still tight talent market, especially for small and mid-sized businesses. So you
Mhm.
can get your report from Paychex free, paychex.com/AWIA. That's paychex.com/AWIA to help you unlock the secret of building your dream team today. So thank you to our friends at Paychex.
Yeah, and can I just say, it's such a value that they're giving this for free because it's basically free consulting. Right? There are so many of us, when I worked in HR, I couldn't afford to hire a consultant to come in and help me do that laundry list of things you just listed. And truly, like looking at it with that lens, it's wonderful. So if you're someone who either can't afford a consultant or maybe just want to double check that they're doing all that they can, it's good for that as well. So
Yeah.
download
So
today.
kudos to our friends at Paychex.
You're
All right,
always
Trish,
on.
let's talk about this movie Up in the Air. Let me set it up with a couple of statistics about the movie before we get started.
Okay.
The blurb or the summary of the movie. The character of Ryan is played by George Clooney. Ryan
Mhm.
is a corporate downsizing expert who travels around the country firing people. When his boss hires Natalie, who proposes firing people via video conference, yeah, even back in 2009, he tries to convince her that this method is a mistake. So if this movie came out in 2009, kind of feels like the first recession movie that came out, right?
Mhm.
Because if you
I think
remember
so.
2008 and 2009, we had the Great Recession and the financial crisis. Lots and lots of people lost their jobs in that time period. And I kind of thought before really researching the movie that it was written in reaction to the recession. But it
Mm.
actually wasn't. It's based on a novel that came out in 2001 by an author called Walter Kern. The novel is also called Up in the Air, and it was adapted for the screen for the 2009 movie. Which the movie was, which this is another fact I didn't know until this morning. Trisha's movie had 6 Oscar nominations, including Best Picture, George
Mhm.
Clooney nominated for Best Actor. The 2 main actresses in the movie both nominated for Best Supporting Actress, Farmiga and Anna Kendrick. It was also nominated for Best Director, Jason Reitman, and Best Adapted Screenplay, also Jason Reitman. Trish nominated for 6 major Oscars in 2010 and won actually a total of 0 Oscars, but it was 6 nominations, which was remarkable, and made $166 million worldwide against only a $25 million budget. So a successful movie by
Sure.
those by both accolades as well as financial. So that's some setup on Up in the Air, Trish. You said you hadn't seen the movie since 2009. Maybe let me get your initial reactions from the rewatch, and then we'll dig into some of the themes of the movie.
Yeah, so I remember when it was being filmed, actually, it was filmed in St. Louis. I'm a St. Louis girl. So the fact that George Clooney and, Anna Kendrick, she was a little more unknown at that point, but
Yeah,
we're
she was
very
very young.
excited. I was working at PwC at the time, and it was in the Bank of America building, which is this big black glass high rise in St. Louis. And much of that movie is filmed in that building because if you look out the windows, like when he's doing things or whatever, talking to people, it was the same views that I was getting from my office. So it
Wow.
was really cool to think he was like in there filming while I was working there. But I did see him out in public one time. Uh, it was at a bar. He was very intoxicated and
Nice.
definitely did not look like what I thought a movie star would look like. So that said, no, when I watched it in 2009, I was still an HR director, and so I was definitely someone who part of my job, a big part of my job had been for many years to either put people on performance improvement plans or lay them off, truly lay off where they could be recalled or just terminate them, right? In downsizings. And so it hit me in a whole different way when I was in the midst of doing those things. I could relate to it from his perspective and how he wanted to make it very human. I completely forgot from the movie that it was her coming in to propose to do these things on Zoom, which at the time was horrific, horrible idea.
It was such a novel concept in 2009. So it wasn't even called Zoom.
It
Zoom
wasn't
wasn't a
even Zoom,
thing. It
right? It
was
wasn't a thing.
essentially
Video.
video calls, which were not very common in workplaces in 2009, quite frankly.
Right. So it seemed very callous and uncaring, even more than and truly the fact of like I've never worked anywhere where we had someone come in externally to help us do our layoffs or terms. I've always been personally involved. I've done probably, unfortunately, uh, probably at least 1,000, if not more, in my career. And I think the thing is you want to be very caring and very personal about it, right? And done right, I mean, you're helping them. You really are. So a lot of it resonated now, looking back on it, what George Clooney's character says in the movie to many of these people, like, you know, he has a quote where he's talking about that anybody who ever built an empire or changed the world sat where you are right now. And it's because they sat there that they were able to do it. And that's the truth. That is the truth because I've been laid off since watching it. I've been laid off. Better things usually come. Like 95% of the time, I would say people wind up doing something better or more rewarding. So
Yeah.
I don't know. Different lens for sure to look back on it now.
Yeah, for sure. And like I think the thing that hits you right away with this movie you were talking about, right, from workplace themes and perspective, obviously is the main thrust of the plot, his
Sure.
job, which is a consultant who works for a corporate downsizing company. So you indicated, Trish, that the organizations you worked at, you never employed third party organizations to come and help you with any downsizing or separations or things like that. Maybe outplacement though, maybe you engaged some outplacement after the fact or something, but that's a little bit more common. But
Yeah.
the having those conversations, right?
It
It's a
was
little
me.
jarring, right, when you're bringing in a third party consultant or a consulting firm to have those difficult conversations, and I sort of get why organizations might go down that route, but on the other hand, it's certainly very impersonal. You don't hear about it too much, and again, this was a novel which turned into a movie, which was not based on anything specific as far as I know, but, it reminded me a little bit, a completely different movie, right? It's the satire of Office Space, which has a
Mhm.
very similar kind of thing happening in that movie where the two consultants
Yeah.
come in and have a series of meetings essentially to figure out some restructuring and some process improvements, but they're really there to just lay people off. And uh, yeah, so you're taking the worst day of your life, right, in a corporate setting, and then the company and these companies had hired George Clooney's firm were kind of distancing themselves from that, which is kind of sad and a little bit cowardly too. And again, I'm not sure how much it really happens today, but it certainly must have happened some, right, for this to
Yeah.
be the main point of this movie.
Well, there are some pros, I think, to doing it that way because if you are an HR professional and you are embedded in your organization and close to these people, it is extremely hard on you as well. And because, yes, they are losing their job. And again, I've been in that seat where I had to make a decision. It was like either move to a bigger market or take the package, right? So I know it from experience how bad it feels. Even you could be a good performer and be let go, right? It's a numbers game. So it's hard to be the person delivering that message. And what I learned over the course of time terminating so many people was that if if you talk with your HR team and they do know you personally, sometimes that alleviates your need to be let go because sometimes your performance slips, right? There could be a reason to it. And if it's the HR person and say your boss who are in there in that meeting with you, they will at least know some background. Obviously, not naming names, but I worked at a job where when I was on maternity leave, they actually held off on a termination until I got back, the very
Hmm.
first day back, because it was going to be a difficult one. And I had to do it, and I knew the person really well, and we did not care for each other to begin with. Very senior person, and it turned out that it was one of the best conversations I ever had with him because he was going through a horrible divorce, but he had told no one in the office. And so I said, "Man, if you would have talked to HR, we could have, or your boss, we could have given you a little slack, right? For a while anyway." So I think if you're hiring like a George Clooney, right? If you're hiring someone external to come and do it, they know none of the background. They don't know these
Yeah.
people. But it's hard to take away someone's livelihood, even if it's earned by their poor performance sometimes. It's still
Yeah.
difficult. And it's
And
dangerous, you
and
know?
some of the dramatic tension in this movie comes from this uh, difference in approach, right, that George Clooney tries to take in his job, right, the George Clooney character of showing empathy, trying to not so much raise the spirits of the people who are being terminated, but at least let them try to even consider, right, a future that might be a little bit better for them than the one that they're leaving, even though he even sort of admits the character does that. There's only so much you can do and
Yeah.
it's going to be an awful experience. And switching to a virtual termination process, right, with centralized operators, if you will, dialing remotely into these organizations around the country to do terminations was never really going to work given the
No.
emotional nature of a termination process and some of the reactions that you see. Just one of the really cool things in this movie too, if folks haven't seen it or haven't seen it in a while, is there are a number of scenes. It's really like a montage, right, of lots of people reacting to the news that they're being terminated from their employment. And, it's person after person after person, must be a dozen, if not or more, right? And it turns out that the filmmakers, when they created this movie, they actually put out ads in St. Louis and in Detroit and posing as documentarians rather than making a fictional movie and asking people to show up who'd been downsized during the recession at that time. And they were
Mhm.
instructed to the people who showed up and that they hired, right, to do these film these scenes. They were just told to look at the camera and react the way you did when you were terminated, and maybe even respond in the way you wish you would have reacted. Because even still, when someone's terminated, even if it's not for any kind of a good reason, we're really trained to not go ballistic and burn bridges and get really too emotional, even though that's probably what many people want to do. So the fact that in the movie they showed these really real reactions, or as close to real as you could really get from real people and not actors, that was pretty powerful, I thought, and an effective part of this movie.
It's extremely effective. And in thinking back over the years, I've had every type of reaction that you see in the movie from people. And often it's like the people that you would anticipate would take it really badly and very hard don't. They're the more stoic ones in my experience. And the opposite, if you are someone you think, oh, this one might be fairly easy conversation, I know this person, whatever. I mean, I've had to have police involved in terminations before, and these are with professional people. This isn't like, I've done manufacturing terms all the way up to the highest level executives, and it's the people who come across the table at you, they're threatening you, they're trying to choke you. Like it gets really, really scary. So in that regard, I do understand why you need to think about maybe not doing it over video. And I know now that's maybe necessary sometimes with remote work and things like that. But it's always to me about making sure that the recipient of the news, number one, the thing the movie does great is keep it short.
Yeah.
You know, here's your package, read it over, let's talk tomorrow. Because if someone tells you you're losing your job, whether you deserved it or not, and like I said, sometimes it's a company that's not doing well, right? So you didn't really deserve it necessarily personally,
Mhm.
but you're part of it. Um, you hear those words the second you tell someone, that's it. Discussion's over, really, because they're mentally checked out. So I did
Yeah, that's a good
like
point.
the movie kind of like he shows that it's a really good training tactic. If you're in HR or you're someone who has to do terminations, watch the movie. If for nothing else, you're going to learn something about how to deliver that message, keeping it short to the point. Here's the paperwork, and we'll talk about this later, you know?
Yeah, try to offer some encouragement, but don't like
Yeah.
paint this rosy picture of
No.
this wonderful future that the person may or may not have. And do your job, do it with respect, but don't do it in a way that is inauthentic, I guess I'd say is
Yeah.
probably a good piece of advice too. Yeah, I did think that. I was going to ask you that as a former HR
Mhm.
leader and someone who's done a lot of terminations, if you actually thought the way some of these terminations were actually handled in this fictional story were effective. So you're saying, yeah, they kind of were.
They really were. I think, even though he was outsourced to do it, it was with compassion, was with empathy. Um, he never directly says that he has been in a layoff or terminated for any reason, but you kind of get the sense that he has because he sort of knows, and maybe it's from doing a lot of them, but I often would fly places just like he did, right? And I think that again, you're coming into a situation where you don't work in this office, you aren't really familiar. It might be part of your company, but you're not familiar. They are familiar.
Right.
So yeah, there's all these nuances of terminating someone effectively. And again, I think it's what they didn't really go into, and when you're in that role, is that there is a lot of conversation typically after a termination, whether it's for cause or whether it's for business poor performance. But I mean, I can think back, there are people I've talked to for more than 10 hours after over the course of the next few weeks. So, and again, those are the
Yeah.
ones where you're really then trying to help them. And maybe it's outplacement comes into play then, but Yeah, a lot of companies don't have that luxury. So
Yeah.
if nothing else, it's an interesting training manual of what to do and what not to do. And especially now, seeing how impersonal it can seem if you're on video, and maybe some things to think about, which the younger person who's suggesting it learns when she has to go out on the road with him. I mean, I would love to hear your perspective. Is maybe have you ever done terminations at all in your career? I know you worked a lot of different
I
HR
haven't. I mean,
jobs.
I've managed people, but not. I've never had to terminate anyone myself. I don't think.
Okay. But like just from the travel perspective, that's the other kind of element in this work movie is even if you are not someone that terminates people, just the grueling travel schedule he keeps. And I know like you had to have some familiarity with that, right? The living on the road, like what resonated with you
Yeah, there's
from
besides the termination stuff, which we talked about now for a little bit, the other kind of workplace thing that stood out for me was that kind of life on the road, road warrior, approach to living and working, which his was excessive the way it's portrayed in the movie as someone who has flown a lot for work and still flies a good bit. The
yeah,
the amount of miles he was logging, one of the undercurrents in the book is his quest to reach 10 million frequent flyer miles on
right,
his preferred airline, which is featured, by the way, his airline and his hotel brand must have had something to do, some support they gave to this movie for how prominently they're both featured throughout
right.
the movie. But 10 million air miles, Trish, is a ridiculous number of air miles. So I've flown a lot my entire, last 15 years or so at least, and
Mhm.
mostly on one airline. But I don't even have 1 million on a single airline. So to have,
Right.
10 million air miles is insane. But being on the road that much, right? It's interesting because there are companies that have people on the road all the time, week after week after week. I did that life for a long time myself. That 4 and 5 days a week at a client site, typically, right? Going to the same place week after week after week, usually. Not flying all over the country necessarily like George Clooney was, but it's grinding, and I think the burnout rate on those kinds of jobs is really high. And one thing I always thought in my career is they're suited more for men than women typically for lots of reasons we could talk about, but they're also suited or the people who gravitate towards those jobs fall into two buckets, right? They fall into
Okay.
younger men who are,
Okay.
25, 27, up to maybe in their early 30s, and then like the plus 50 group, right?
Yeah.
And because in the middle, right, often is when people are settling down, perhaps getting married, perhaps having kids, things like that, right? So a lot of
Right.
people get sort of cycled out of those constant road jobs, right? And so I'd go on these projects all the time or show up at client sites, and that's who would be working them. Like, when I worked in Saudi, the story of Saudi that I've told 1,000 times, but I worked in Saudi Arabia for a couple of years, right? And there were two groups on this project. There were guys like me who were between 25 and say 30, and then there
Mhm.
was a whole bunch of plus 50 guys and nobody in the middle. And that's who does those jobs, right? And I always thought that was really interesting. But the burnout on those jobs, Trish, and you didn't either, but we traveled a lot, not nearly as much as the George Clooney character travels. Man,
Right.
I am like burned out on it, like myself, and doing a quarter of what that character was doing. That can wear you down. In fact, I don't know if companies do enough to support kind of people in those jobs either, just kind of with stress reduction, mental health,
Yeah.
physical health, because it's an unhealthy lifestyle usually too.
All good points. I don't think companies do that. You're right. I think too, there's a little bit of whether you're talking to someone in the company before you're getting onto a job like this, there's this glamorous side of travel, business travel. I mean, I remember going on my first couple business trips when I was in my early 20s. I thought it was fantastic. And I'm staying at these really nice hotels and really fabulous meals. And those things are all still true. We travel a good bit still in spring and fall particularly, but and our clients treat us well, right? We're
Oh
wined
yeah.
and dined and all the things. But you're talking about also, even if you're not terminating people, it's like days that start at 7 a.m. Or earlier sometimes if you have other things you're working on, right? And then you're not back to your room till almost midnight usually. And that's not even talking about drinking. Like, I don't drink, you don't drink. And it's still, these are long, grueling days of mental and physical exhaustion. And it's not as glamorous. I can even say, like, if you're on social media and you have friends that don't travel and they're like, oh my gosh, you're in this country or that country. And I'm like, it's harder than it looks, right? But I know from you, because you're a Delta man, right? There is
I
some
was for a really long time. Yeah.
yeah, so I'd love to hear your perspective on kind of like George Clooney is really going after the status. It's not even the number of miles, but he wants that status. And we have other friends like this too, where once you get status, I'm that way. I'm a United girl, and like once you get a certain level, you do not want to go backwards. How did that play out, like when you were starting your career to now? And does that
Yeah, I
relate at
think
all?
I think that portrayal of the George Clooney character really striving to reach this kind of mythical 10 million miler status, and enjoying all the perks, right? There's quite a few scenes in the movie of
Yeah,
him going on the short line and the fast check-in and being served, as a frequent guest, right, in a certain way. And that's all really true. Like once you start traveling more than occasionally, the indignities of travel and the hassles of travel begin to sort of add up, right? And so one of the ways to reduce those and make travel a little bit more pleasant and a little more tolerable, especially for frequent travelers, right? It's the upgrades, right? It's the access to the lounge in the airport. It's the nicer room at the hotel. It's the expedited check-in, right? If you get to a hotel that's got a long line, all those little things, right? I once Trish actually it happened to me twice on Delta where I had a really tight connection. It happened to me once in Atlanta and once in Detroit. We had a really tight connection I had to make to get to where I was going,
yeah,
and I was gonna have to run through the airport. Absolutely gonna have to run, and got off the airplane fully ready to charge down the jetway to try to run for it and hopefully make my flight. And there was a Delta employee with a little tablet with my name on it, and
I love it.
whisked me down the stairs of the jetway into a waiting SUV, Porsche, no less, that we were
Right?
both times, to drive me across the tarmac directly to my connecting flight at the next, terminal over, right? And get out of the get out of the Porsche, climb up the stairs, and get right on the
Wow.
plane, right? It happened to me twice, and it was again, that's because I was a top level status person and they know, right, in their systems where all those top level people are and what their connection like what's happening with them as they're moving through the system on any given day. And yeah, so when you think about those things, and if you're going to be out there on the road, and if you're a company sending your people out on the road regularly, what can you do to make that experience a little more pleasant for them? Spend a little money, buy them the airport lounge access if you need
That's
to,
right.
or up let companies get so crazy about their silly travel rules and policies, right? You have to buy the cheapest flight all the time, right? Or the cheapest hotel. Let them pick whatever airline they want. Like, let them pick whatever hotel they want. Let them accrue those points. Eventually they add up and they can maybe take some time away and take their family somewhere. Like things like that always baffled me. Like why I had to fight with a company. And I had to do this a couple of times where like you said, I flew on Delta, right? Everybody usually sort of picks one airline they fly in all the time.
Yeah,
So I had a lot of status on Delta. I'd get upgraded all the time, all the things. They treated me really well. I wanted to fly on Delta because I knew my experience was going to be much nicer and more pleasant. And I had a fight with the company I was working for, spend 40 more dollars to fly on Delta cross
right.
country versus say fly on United and sit in row 37
In
in
the
a
middle.
center seat, right? Versus sit, in seat 2A on Delta and being treated nicely, right? So little things like that make sense, even though companies don't like to do that because it's an exception, right? It's easier to have a policy and enforce it versus to treat people individually and treat people like humans and try to make their life experience and their work experience a little bit better.
I'm glad you brought that up. I hadn't really considered that. And that's something now you talked at the top of the hour where we were talking about it's still a war for talent and it's going to continue, right? We've talked in other shows about the demographics and birth rates and so forth are all low. And so maybe that's one way. Yes, you have a general travel policy, right, for most travel. But yes, if you have people that are going to be in travel, like high travel roles, have a different policy even for them to have some of those perks, because you're right. You were on Delta because you were in cities where that was the most convenient hub of that airline, right? And so it doesn't make sense to even fly on other ones because you might be adding in layovers and other things. And again, when it comes to saving $40 or having an employee that's cared for, right, and that wants to stay with you because they are cared for, I mean, I would probably quit a job if travel were difficult. I
Yeah.
would not be if it were
I,
overly difficult, I wouldn't stay. I will
I do
say that.
think I do think companies run the risk of having a policy that might save a few dollars here and there, but then makes an employee fly to different hours that they don't want to fly on, or sit waiting in an airport for many hours on a connection.
Mhm.
That's less convenient, but it's a little bit cheaper, right? We all know it's more expensive to fly at 8 a.m. than it is to fly right at 8 p.m. and connect in Atlanta between 9:30 and midnight waiting for that last flight home, right? It's cheaper, but it's worse for the employee. It's more stressful, and it's a terrible experience. So I think the road warrior elements that they get into in the story may be a little too deep because honestly, Trish, most
There's a lot.
people don't live that way. They don't travel that much for work, right? So the scene where George Clooney is with his love interest in the movie, who's also a road warrior herself, and they're talking about rental car policies and how do you
Oh
get a
yeah.
better upgrade. And the sad thing is, like, I've had conversations like that in my life with people, and looking back on them and watching these two characters have their conversation, I realize how stupid they are. But it is sort of the
Yeah.
life of people who travel all the time. It is a weird little subculture,
Mhm.
and I was part of it for a while. I'm less into it now, right? Because we don't travel quite as much, and
Right.
I'm not as dogmatic about I have to fly Delta, because where I live
Well, we
now,
don't have a travel policy. We have the luxury of not doing
yeah, and
that.
where I live now, Delta's not as convenient, right, as it
Right.
once was for me. So, yeah,
Well, I was glad it was in the movie. I had forgotten that aspect of it, that it shows that grueling side of travel. And it was interesting to see again, George Clooney is the older gentleman in the movie. The other girl is much younger. She's not done that. She's unprepared. She's got the wrong kind of suitcase. She's struggling, right,
yeah,
to do it that way. So I did like that it was showing different generations in the workforce, both learning from each other. Neither one was 100% correct in their approach. And
yeah,
so I think that by the end, you get to somewhere that's a little more human for both of them, a little more appreciative of maybe the business life they're leading, because George Clooney was kind of running away from everything, it felt like, for much of the movie. And by the end, you kind of see that turn around too. So I don't
yeah.
know.
I don't want to give it
But
away, but he's changed some, but I don't know really, right? Because
yeah,
if you get to the very end of the movie, you'll be questioning that. But the last thing, Trish, I think we should touch on, though, in terms of the workplace or the world of work, was actually a note you made that you wanted to talk about, which is there's a scene in the movie where the three main characters, George Clooney, his love interest, whose name is escaping me right now, the character, and the new employee, right, who works with George Clooney, they crash essentially a tech conference, which is
yes,
happening at this big hotel and resort they're staying in, and they just
yep,
crash the conference. They swipe a badge when they walk in. They're in this conference, and this conference is like typical conference, maybe, but also kind of a good reminder to folks about, hey, like there's a lot of weird stuff that happens sometimes at these business conferences with the partying and the carrying on and the late nights and all that. And it actually, I thought, was pretty accurate portrayal of the kinds of things that can happen.
it was. And again, I was trying to put myself back in that 2009 lens when I was looking at it. And because that's when I was more going to those conferences on a regular basis. And as an HR leader, right? And HR is like you're so buttoned down all the time, but it's like going to Sherm. You go to Sherm Annual and people will be. I remember we went to one in I think it was New Orleans. All these people had their badges on and they are wasted, just wasted, making out with each other, dancing on each other. Like it was craziness. And I just wanted to go around to each of them and go, give me your badge. Just give me your badge. You know, and now it's even worse with social media. If someone, it's like you'd almost want to take pictures of them if they were, doing craziness. Because anyway, I think that it's a good lesson to say, if you go to an event, these things do happen. Um, be mindful of who you're around and what you're wearing. And you're not meant to go on a conference to completely lose control because then you can lose your job, really. And yeah, I definitely conference much differently now at this age than I did in
Yeah,
2000.
no, as do I. I mean, I never sort of carried on like the way the things were portrayed in the movie. It was a little bit
Right.
over the
It
top
was
a
a
little bit,
extreme.
but fairly accurate, right? In terms of the
Yeah,
parties and the dancing, the celebrity guests, the open bars, really late nights. And I can recall a number of times, Trish, in my career, well, with the HR Tech conference, right, which I've been a part of for a long time, where it would be 6:30 or so in the morning, and I'd be hitting the lobby, right, in my suit to head to the conference because I had to get there so early, and on my walk from the elevator bank to where the conference was, I'd pass other people who were just coming back, right, from
yeah,
their evening wherever, right, that I knew, right,
yeah,
industry people I knew, and
all the time.
they'd kinda look away, maybe you'd wave, but no one talked to me, but, like,
Yeah.
because not saying anybody was ashamed, but everybody's an adult, you can do what you want, but, it can get a little crazy, and certainly, we see that at events like SHRM and other events where, like, we're over it, right? Because 'Cause we've gone to 100 conferences over the last 10 years, right? But, a lot of people go to 1 conference a year or 1
Right.
conference every 2 or 3 years, right?
Yeah.
And it's their big opportunity to cut loose a little bit, so just yeah, be mindful. Fall conference season's coming up, and, be smart out there, I guess, is all I'd say.
Yeah, if nothing else, watch the movie just before you go to a fall conference so you kind of see what it looks like when you're doing it. I
Yeah.
don't know. I do think that one of the things, we have changed a lot as we talked about with technology and we're using video call even for what we're doing now. In 2009 we weren't doing that. Um, but I think that the other thing that's changing in conferences are just people are more health conscious. There are more, you kind of mentioned that, it's not the healthiest lifestyle when you're on the road all the time or you're at
Right.
conferences all the time. There are more healthful options in food. Like, for example, you and I don't drink, so there are definitely mocktail options or other options. So I do feel like it's getting a little more friendly to people who aren't going to party, right? You're going to do work. The way when I want to see friends, I want to see some people, I want to meet people, but it's my job too, right? So I don't want to be hungover the next day and having to get on stage and try and function, right? So I do think that that's something a company can do as well. If your people are going to be on the road like that, have some training, have some, etiquette training and some just business training on how to lead a healthy lifestyle on the road. Because if you've got, Gen Z or even younger millennials joining your organization, they might have never been told that, how to do that, what that looks
Yeah,
like.
I would think for sure, much like the Anna Kendrick character in the movie was newer to the workforce and was less experienced both at work, but she was also less experienced right outside of work too. And so,
Right.
the George Clooney character tries to look out for her in those circumstances. And you're right, they could new workers could certainly benefit from some of that kind of training and education and in an onboarding scenario. If you're gonna hire somebody and put them on the road for business, yeah, you should definitely have an hour or two where you sit them down with some experienced folks who've done that lifestyle at your company, take them through some things. Yeah. They did that for us. I mentioned Saudi. I'll mention it again. Before we went to Saudi, I had like a 3-hour session with some folks who had been there and worked there for a while. And they took us through a lot of different elements of what it was gonna be like to go there and work, so and it was super helpful.
Yeah, I would say the organizations I've worked with, especially the large ones where you had people in either Asia Pacific or the Middle East, we did training for them as well. Like anyone that was relocating or just working longer term on an assignment like that, because there are certain customs too you need to adhere to and things for your own personal safety as well when you're traveling. So
Yeah.
I was very lucky that I worked in organizations when I was younger in my career where those classes and again back to etiquette, things like that, how to handle yourself, those were taught. And it was just as important as more of your technical skills, really. Those are the soft skills that you need to understand and how to, and not just, I guess the one thing was like, they were kind of showing her like, oh, we're gonna go to this party, we're gonna crash it, we're gonna get drunk, whatever. Um, they knew how to handle themselves and she
Mhm.
didn't.
Right.
right? So they're kind of showing her, but also it kind of backfired a little bit. So, you
Yeah, yeah. Well, they had
that's
done it
why
before.
maybe
Mm.
HR could probably get involved in that and make sure, like, yes, here's some of the horror stories from the road, which we could do a whole separate show with people we know who've had horror stories on the
Yeah,
road.
and that's certainly like a whole nother kind of, yeah, subculture of work. And I don't feel like I'm in that as much as I used to be because there was a definitely, I mean, I did the weekly consulting thing for a number of years. This before all of this stuff, before the podcast and all that, where I would get on a plane every Monday morning and fly somewhere and be there all week long and fly back on Friday. I did that for 5 years probably earlier in my career, and yeah, that's a grind, but it's a different kind of a grind, and it almost becomes commuting. Today they call it super commuting, right? Like that's the fashionable term
Oh,
for it.
okay.
But back then we didn't look at it that way, but it does after a while feel like commuting, right? And versus traveling for work. But that's another
Yeah.
story, but, it's a great movie, though. I mean, I say 7 out of 10 if I was ranking it. I liked it a lot. Yeah, I didn't love it. The only other movie I can think of, Trish, that kinda had that Great Recession, financial crisis vibes, which is a movie we have talked about on the show, which is The Big Short, which
Mhm.
came out a few years later than this
Yeah.
movie, but was really directly related to the financial crisis in that same era, right, of what was going on in the economy in the US, which honestly was a much better movie, I think, than Up in the Air. A different movie, of course, but
Right.
a good one as well if you want to your business financial crisis era vibes on. So I'd recommend that too. So, but yeah, good stuff. I'm glad it was fun to watch this movie again.
It was. I'm glad we did it. You came up with this suggestion, and it was funny because I shared some of the ones you mentioned. We've done a lot of the Workplace Movie Hall of Fame movies. It's the one we get asked to do the most, first off. But I put it on LinkedIn, and here were, links to some of the ones we did. And I actually asked for people to make some recommendations. So we'll have to
Mm.
go through there. We got lots and lots of good
Okay.
workplace movie or, workplace adjacent, right? Where you get
Yeah.
some sort of things out of them. So yeah, we've got a lot more we can do in the coming, 12 to 18 months probably.
And I think we're going to branch out into TV, quote unquote,
We
right?
are.
I heard a rumor that the Dallas Cowboy cheerleader documentary is on the docket for our next quote unquote workplace movie Hall of Fame show, even though it's not exactly a movie.
It is. And I'm going to tell you what, they're beautiful women. I always have thought that, since I was a little girl and everything. Everybody loves the cheerleaders. It's fascinating. It's not something I intended to watch, but like there was nothing else available, really. So I thought I'll watch an episode. So many workplace issues. And
The
this is
people who run that team are the worst. I'm gonna tell you that right now. I've not
the
watched all the
word.
episodes yet, but
Yeah,
the people who are in charge of that cheerleading team and the owner,
the
the
worst.
Cowboys representatives, they're the worst people in the world, and
Don't work there.
I'm coming
Yeah.
down very hard on them soon.
I want to as well. So people, please go watch at least a couple episodes. And if you want, like, weigh in beforehand, message us. You can find us anywhere on
That
social.
this
Tell us what you're thinking. Like,
Yeah,
it's
I'm looking
atrocious.
forward to that. Well, I'm looking forward to that one. So, all right, Trish, let's cut it off here. Up in the Air, 2009. You can find it on Max, I believe, if you want to watch it right now. That's
Yep.
where I found it. Stream it there if you want to catch it. Recommend. And thanks to our friends, of course, at Paychex for supporting this nonsense for so long. But we appreciate them. And thanks, Trish. It was really fun and good to see you.
Good to see you too. Thanks,
All right.
Paychecks.
Thank you. And thanks for listening, everybody. Check all the archives at hrhappyhour.net. We will see you next time. And bye for now.